Hi and welcome to another section, and in this section we will explore the second workspace, which is the edit workspace. So this is how the interface of the edit workspace looks like by default, and if it doesn't, what you can do is go to the workspace, press this button, reset UI layout, and now hopefully this should exactly look like that. And this area is the timeline where we apply all the editing. And if I go to the previous workspace here, remember in the previous step, what we did was we added some clips to the media pool, and we also made a bin to which we added some of those clips. So now these 3 clips are added. And if I go to the edit workspace, the same clips will show up in this area. And if I go and select those 4 clips originally selected, now it will change to the 4 clips selected in the previous workspace. So whatever I select in the first workspace, it shows up here. The timeline is empty right now because I haven't added anything to the timeline yet. Now let me discuss the overall interface of this workspace. These 2 windows are for previewing the clips, and these are for different purposes as we'll explore soon. Here, this area shows the clips, and this is for basically this whole thing represents the media pool. So I can turn it on or off, and if I turn it off, I get more real estate for the timeline and for these preview windows, but right now I'll just enable them. And here again, just like in the previous workspace, on the top we have some panels on the left side and on the right side. So let's quickly go through these panels. This is the media pool. I can toggle it on or off, and this contracts this media pool so that we can see more area for the timeline. So this timeline kind of expands when we press this. I'm not going to expand that. This one, it basically hides the navigation and these bins so that we can get more area for these clips. So right now I can only see this area for the clips, but if I press it again, now I can see these bins. Then we have something called effects library, where we have lots of effects, and as we proceed, we'll be applying some of these effects on our clips. So I don't need that right now. Then similarly, we have edit, index, then we have sound library. On the right, we have mixer for applying audio effects. We have the same old metadata panel that we explored in the previous section, which basically shows further details for the clips selected. And then there is something called inspector. So all of these are different panels for different purposes, and as we proceed, we will be exploring each of them. So depending on what I am doing at the moment and how much area I need for the timeline and for these previews, I can turn these panels on or off. Similarly, right now timeline seems quite big and preview looks quite small. So what I can do is I can drag this edge to get more area for the previews and lesser area for the timeline. So as need be, I will be playing around with these different areas. And right now I'll just enable the media pool. Right now you see the timeline is empty and we have 4 clips in this area. But when I select and drag one of these and bring it to the timeline area, here you see these tracks are automatically created, and this thumbnail is also created in this area. So now I place it here, these tracks are created, and this thumbnail is also created. So this thumbnail basically represents this timeline where we put videos and do editing. So this thumbnail is not a video, it's just representing this timeline. I can double click its name. Right now it was named by default, but I can double click it and change its name to timeline for project 1. So in this case, timeline was created automatically for us. But timelines can also be created in a few different ways. So to show that, let me undo this by pressing Ctrl Z on Windows and Command Z on Mac. And when I press that, this clip is gone from the timeline, these tracks and this thumbnail, all of it is vanished. So now let's explore a few different ways in which we can create this timeline. So one of the methods is to select some of these clips, right click on those, and there is an option that says create new timeline using selected clips. And when I pick this option, in this window, I can give it a starting time code, which by default is 1.0000, and timeline name, let me rename it my timeline. I can select how many video tracks or audio tracks I want. By default, both of these are one each. And audio track type, I can even select mono or stereo or different types of audio tracks. And here, by default, this option is selected, which says use selected mark in or out points. So these options are used when I don't want the whole clip, I want a part of that. So I can mark in and mark out a part of this clip and select it. So right now I'm not using that, but this is how it comes by default. So when I click create, again, you see the timeline is created, these tracks are created, and here you can see a new thumbnail is also created with the name I gave it. These different clips are placed on the timeline in the default sequence, which I can further change. Now to demonstrate the other method, again, I will press Command Z or Control Z on Windows to undo that, and again these tracks and this thumbnail is gone. So this time I can select multiple clips and again drag and drop them to the timeline, and now you can see that this new timeline is created for us. I can change their position, I can shuffle them around, and in this way a new timeline is created with one audio and one video track. So this is kind of similar to the first method which we saw, but I wanted to show you that you can also drag and drop multiple clips into the timeline. And after that, I can zoom out. Now what I can do is I can select one of these clips and maybe bring it to the empty space so that I can shuffle them in a different order if I want. I'm just selecting them, and you can see that this is the audio part of the clip, this is the video part, and when I select any of these, by default both of them are selected automatically together. In this way I can just select them and bring them close to each other so that they are in the new order, new sequence that I want. And this is another way to add multiple clips to the timeline and adjust their sequence. Now there is one more method to create timeline, and for that again I will undo this step by pressing Command Z on Mac or Control Z on Windows multiple times because I had some reshuffling going on here. So now I'm back to square one, and here we have some clips. Again, we have an empty timeline. Now the last way to create timeline is using bins. So for that, I will go to the previous workspace, which is the media workspace. And here the bin I'm going to create is, let me rename it bin 2. Okay, that's fine. And now what I'll do is I'll select 3 of these clips and drop them into this bin. So right now, one of these clips is outside this bin, and when I select this bin contains 3 clips. So what I can do is I can right click on this bin, and here it gives me an option to create new timeline using selected bin. And when I pick this option, it asks me further for the starting time code, the name of the timeline, the number of tracks I want for audio or video. So 1 track for audio, 1 track for video is fine. And here I can further change the type of the audio track. So let me rename it bin timeline. And when I press create, here you see that this new thumbnail for timeline has been created with the same name I give it. And if I go to the next tab, which is the edit workspace, here you see that the same selected clips have been added to the timeline. So these are a few different ways in which we can create these timelines either by dragging and dropping clips into the timeline directly, or by right-clicking on a bin and picking this option of create new timeline using selected bin. In the next lesson, we will explore the different ways in which media can be added to the timeline. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next lesson. Hello and welcome to another lesson. Now, how do you manipulate media inside timeline? To see that, let's add videos to the timeline, and there are around 7 to 8 different ways to do that. Some of these ways are simple and some of them are a bit advanced and sophisticated. In this lesson, let's look at the simple ways first to add media to the timeline, and let's save the advanced ways for the next lesson. So let's look at the first method, and this is the simplest and most obvious way, which is by dragging the whole clip. First, I can preview it in the preview window to make sure it's the right clip, and then we can simply drag and drop it to the timeline. So this timeline, I can zoom in or zoom out in this timeline by using this plus and minus button. So if I want to zoom in, I can press this plus button, or I can press the command and plus button to zoom in, or on Windows it could be control and plus button. If I want to zoom out, I can either press this minus button or press command and minus on a Mac, or control and minus on Windows. So in this way I can compress or expand this timeline. And now you might have noticed that here initially this window was empty, right? So if I, let's say, delete this, here again it is empty, because right now I think it's an ideal time to introduce you to both these preview windows and what is the difference. This one shows the preview of the clips in the media pool, right? So I can see the preview of individual clips before placing them to the timeline. And this one is specific to showing preview of the items in the timeline. So right now there is nothing in the timeline, so this is empty. But as soon as I drop one of these clips to the timeline, now automatically it starts showing the preview of the timeline wherever the playhead is. So if I move this playhead, it shows preview of different sections of this clip. And here this shows the size of the preview. Right now it's at 34% because I have set it to fit. So depending on the size of the window currently, it fits this video automatically into this size. But I can also select 50% or even 100%, and you can see that I can only see a small portion of that. So in these situations, if you want to see a bigger preview of this, an external monitor would be a good option. But let me just go back to the fit option, and this preview is good enough for me. Here it shows the length of the clip, okay? And then if I preview that, if I play it here it will show the frame rate, right? So right now if it is not playing, the frame rate will not be shown. But when I play it, now here it shows the frame rate of that. Now here in the timeline, if I want to play this, I'll press spacebar once and it starts playing. If I want to pause it, I just instead of this stop button, I can also use the spacebar. So press it once, it plays. Press it again and it pauses. And here this is the time code. It starts from 1.00, but as I play it, here you can see at the end here it is 7 seconds and 1 millisecond. And here again, this is the pointed edges because the end of the timeline has reached. Now here you might have seen that, this method brought the whole clip to the timeline, right? But in many situations, we don't want the whole clip. In certain situations, we might want to just add a portion of this clip instead of the whole clip. So for that, we will go ahead to the second method, which basically helps us in selecting a portion of any clip. So now let's say I want the same clip, but instead this time I want a portion of that. So what I'll do is I'll first double click to see the preview of that, and see it's only in the preview window yet. It's not in the timeline, right? Because I haven't dragged and dropped it to the timeline yet. So now I can bring this playhead to the start. Now here is the video from which I want to take a short portion. So what I'll do is I'll bring this marker to the start of the portion I want. And let's say I want to start from this point. So what I'll do is I'll press I on my keyboard, I for in point. And you see the remaining portion of the video is highlighted, as you can see on this white line. The initial, this earlier portion is grayed out because it starts from this point on, and now this is the remaining portion of the video has been highlighted. And I can also do the same. Instead of pressing I on my keyboard, let me undo that. And here is a button which is called Mark In button. So I can press that, and it does the same thing as pressing I on the keyboard. So it creates a mark in point, and again the remaining portion of the video is highlighted. So I can keep previewing further. And let's say I want a portion of this video starting from this position until this position. So now this is where I want to create an out point. So what I'll do is I'll press O on my keyboard, and see this remaining portion of the video which I didn't want, it has been grayed out, and now this highlighted portion is what I selected. This is my in point and this is my out point. I can also select the out point. Instead of typing O on my keyboard, I can use this Mark Out button. So if I undo this by pressing Ctrl Z on Windows or Command Z on Mac, and now I can press this Mark Out button, and it does exactly the same thing. So now this is the portion I have selected from this video. So this is how you select in point, by pressing I on the keyboard or this Mark In button. And for selecting the Mark Out point, you press O on the keyboard for out point, or press this Mark Out button. And this is the way you select a certain portion from a big clip. So now if I drag and drop it to the timeline, this is not the original clip, but this is a trimmed version of that. Starting from this position to this position, this clip basically shows this portion of the original video. Now, of course, the amount of footage dragged down to the timeline depends on your in and out points. If these 2 points are further apart, dragging will bring a bigger chunk of your clip to the timeline. And if they are close to each other, dragging will bring a smaller portion of the clips to the timeline. So you can manipulate size of your clip using these 2 points. So let's say I further manipulate these in and out points. So I press I here to finalize this in point, and let's click here and press O. So now this is a much smaller portion of the original clip. So if I drag and drop it here, you can see that this represents a much smaller portion of the original clip. You can tell from their length that the original in and out points were further apart. So this brought a bigger chunk of the original video. And here the in and out points were further close to each other. So it translated into a shorter portion of the original clip. Now, another important point about these in and out points is that in the last lesson, we added some clips to the timeline directly from bins. Now, if I had selected some in and out points in those clips before adding them to the bins, when we create a timeline from that bin, those in and out points will also be shown on your timeline. So this kind of helps in saving the work you have already done. Now, so far you have seen that when we drag and drop it to the timeline, you see that both audio and video portions of this clip are brought to the timeline. As shown here with these blue colored portions, these show the video portion of this clip, and these green portions, these shows the audio portion of the clip, right? But let's say we have made a selection and now I want only audio of this clip. Okay, so this is the portion, and from this portion I only want the audio. So what I'll do is, you see these two icons that appear if I bring my cursor here. If I bring my cursor out, those are gone. But if I bring back my cursor here, these come up, these are visible. So what I can do is, if I only want the audio of this portion, I can, instead of dragging this whole clip, I can click here and drag it to the timeline, and you see only the audio comes to the timeline because this waveform signifies audio. So when I drag it, it only brings audio of the selected portion. What if I only want video instead? Okay, so for that I can click this frame icon and from here drag it to the timeline, and you see now it is only the blue portion which reflects the video. There is no audio. So in this way I can use this icon to add only the video of this portion, and I can use this to add only the audio of this portion. And if I don't use any of these, by default both audio and video will come to the timeline as we saw before. So these are the two different ways in which we can import videos in timeline by dragging and dropping. You can drag and drop clips to the timeline directly and then do the trimming, which we will explore later in this section. Or you can use some initial trimming here using the in and out points, then drop the clips in timeline and fine-tune your trimming in the timeline. Both methods are okay, and it also kind of depends on your situation. Now, instead of dragging and dropping it to the timeline, what if I drag it and drop it from the preview monitor to the program monitor? A pop-up window with 7 options will appear, and each of these has a different way of bringing media into the timeline. So let's see each of them in detail in the next lesson. Hi and welcome back. In this lesson, we will look at a few more ways to add videos to the timeline, and these methods are a little bit advanced. And before starting, a word of caution. Some of these tools may seem confusing to you in the beginning, and that's what I thought while I was learning Davinci Resolve. But just within a few hours of practicing these tools, all the confusion vanished and I realized how useful these tools are. So let's dive right in. And for this lesson, I have already added 2 clips to the timeline, and I deliberately left a space or a gap in between. And now for this lesson, I'm not going to worry about the content of these clips. I'll just try to explain how the tools we are going to study, how those tools are used. So let's say that there is a gap on the timeline and I want to place one of these clips here in the gap. Now let's assume that I want to place the new clip at the starting point of this gap. So what I'll do is I'll bring the playhead to the start of this gap where I want to place the new clip. So let's say here is the clip I am looking for. So what I'll do is, these were the initially selected in and out points. Now here, I think it's a good time to tell you how to delete the in and out points you might have already selected. So you see the way we select in point is by pressing I. To delete that in point, you simply press Alt I or Option I. Alt I for Windows and Option I for Mac. Okay, and you see that in point is gone. Similarly, this out point, I don't want it any further, so I'll press Alt O on Windows and Option O on Mac operating system, and those in and out points have been taken care of. Now what I'll do is I want to select some new in and out points for this clip. So I bring my marker here, press I, and a new in point is selected. Bring it here. because let's say I want this clip to be placed here. So I press O. Now this highlighted portion shows which part of the clip is selected. Now what I do is I drag this to this window, and here I pick the insert option. And as the name suggests, this will insert the selected clip at the current position of the playhead. So keep your eyes on the red playhead in the timeline. And when I press this, you see this whole new portion was created and this new clip was placed in that. So everything else remains the same, just shifted towards the right. And as a result, the timeline extended by an amount equal to the length of the newly inserted clip. So let me undo that for a moment by pressing Command Z on my Mac or Control Z on Windows. Now let me do it again. When I press Insert, here you see that initially this was just a playhead, and here this whole area expanded just enough to accommodate this length of the video. So this was kind of inserted within this narrow portion and the whole timeline got bigger. So for example, let's say the initial timeline was 30-second long, and if I inserted a 5-second long clip anywhere in that timeline, now the new length of the timeline would be 35 seconds. Just giving you an example. And to look at the further tools, let me go ahead and undo that. Now for the next tool, what I do is I drag it, and here this is the next tool, which is called Overwrite. And as the name suggests, it will overwrite an equal length of the timeline. So you see this portion of the timeline, here there was a gap and here there was a clip. So what it did was it replaced an equal length of the timeline irrespective of whether there was a gap in here already or a clip or a mixture of both. It does not look at that. It just looks at the length of the timeline equal to the length of this clip and just replaces that with the new clip. With this tool, nothing else will change or shift. So again, I'll undo that to look at the third tool. Now to demonstrate this third tool called Replace, what I'll do is I'll select this clip, and what I'll do is there are no in and out points selected. What I'll do is I'll bring this clip playhead to the start. Now when I drag it and select the Replace tool, what it will do is it will look at what lies ahead of this playhead current position. So right now this is a clip. So when I select this Replace option, now what it will do is it will replace this length of the clip with an equally long portion of this clip. Okay, so the initial clip here was, if I undo that, it was clip 11. So the length of this clip has not been changed, but just the contents of this length have been changed. So initially it was clip 11, now it is just clip. Okay, similarly, if I bring the playhead here, and now if I redo this process, now this whole length has been replaced with this clip. Similarly, if I undo that and let me repeat this for this gap. So now if I repeat that, see, this time it took a completely different length of this clip depending on how long this gap was. So it will take the appropriate portion of the clip depending on whether there is a gap or there is a clip, and also depends on how long that gap or clip is. So the length of this clip or the gap are used to select an equally long portion of the clip we drag. Next we have is Fit to Fill. So for that, let me undo the previous edits. So if I pick this fourth option, which is called Fit to Fill, it's also called 3-point edit, as I'll explain further in this lesson. So this option is used to fill gaps in the timeline with other clips. So suppose there is a gap in your timeline that you want to fill with this particular clip. So bring your playhead to the start of the gap to be filled, and set an in point for the clip that you want to place here. Press I to select that in point, and when you drag it and select this fit to fill option, it will take an appropriate portion of the clip long enough to fill this gap. So it will first look at how long this gap is and automatically select an equally long portion of this clip starting from the in point we selected. And if I don't select an in point, it will just take this clip from the start. Now it is also called a 3-point edit. And why is that? Let me undo that for a moment. So when you place your playhead on the start of this gap and press X, in points and out points of this gap are created within timeline. And here is the in point in the timeline, and here is the out point, and I can further change these, but let's keep them here. Now I go to the preview and let me select a different in point. So basically I have selected 3 points. This is the in point in the timeline, the out point in the timeline is the second point, and there's a third point which is the in point. So first, second, and third point, these points have already been selected, and I don't need to tell the fourth point or the out point here in the preview, as Davinci Resolve will take care of this part for me, as you already saw. So what it'll do is it will look at how long the gap is, and it will appropriately choose the length of this clip to completely fill that gap starting from this in point. So see, if I choose this option fit to fill, it will automatically replace this gap with an equally long portion of this clip starting from the in point. And similarly, if I create another gap in the timeline, let's create a different gap of a different length, and the playhead is at the start of this gap. So let me press X, and now these in points and out points have been created in the timeline. These are the first 2 points. The third point, let me select it here. And now when I repeat this process using this fit to fill tool, see, this time it took a completely different portion or completely different length of this clip depending on the length of this gap. I'll go ahead and undo all of that. The next option is place on top. So what it does is it places the selected clip on another track on top of the clip already present in the timeline without overwriting it. So right now, if I bring my playhead here, here is a clip already present in the timeline. So if I drag it and choose this fifth tool, which is place on top, what it will do is it will place this new clip exactly at the same location, but at the upper track without overwriting the original track. So here was the playhead, so it did not affect the earlier track. It just placed the new clip on top of that in the upper track. So that is why, as the name suggests, it's called place on top. And let me undo that for a moment. So of course you can do it manually, right? So you can drag it, and instead of selecting this place on top tool, you can just bring it and place it on the upper track manually. Again, I'll undo that to demonstrate the next tool. And the next tool we have is append at end. So what it will do is it will place the selected clip at the end of the timeline. See? So irrespective of whatever the location of the playhead is currently, it will disregard that, and whatever we drop into the timeline, it will be placed at the end of the timeline. So if I undo that and let me bring my playhead to the very beginning, now it won't consider the position of this playhead at all. It will just bring it to the end of the timeline, as you saw here. And again, these pointed edges basically signify that this is the end of the timeline. Again, I'll undo that. And lastly, there is a tool called ripple overwrite. And with this tool, we can ripple overwrite a clip already present in the timeline with a new clip. So right now you see here, this is the position of the playhead in the timeline, and this is the clip in front of that. So when I select this last tool, ripple over right, it will just ripple over right that clip already present here. Some of these tools are also available here above the timeline. As you can see, this is the insert tool, override tool, and replace tool. These are all available here. So you have this, and this. These three tools are repeated, but some are not. So it depends which tools are more frequently used. They also made them available here. These tools help to easily select the right content or length of the video to be placed at the exact location in the timeline. I hope it wasn't too confusing for you, but thanks for watching this lesson, and let's continue learning in the next lesson.